Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enchanting Economics in New Mexico. This podcast is a production of BBER, the recognized expert in socioeconomic data for the state of New Mexico. Your host, as usual, is myself, Rayanne McKernan, and unfortunately, Sarun Vitale isn't joining us today. But we do have Michael, aka Mo O'Donnell, the current director of BBER, joining us. Thanks for talking to me, Mo.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So there has been a lot of media coverage lately on New Mexico's unemployment situation. Can you just enlighten us what is going on? What is causing all of this ruckus?
Sure. So New Mexico, like many other states are experiencing right now, is seeing that apparently, as reported by a bunch of businesses, basically businesses are looking for workers and they're not able to fill positions. And these positions are in industries that basically businesses haven't had much trouble recruiting into, such as leisure and hospitality types of industries. And essentially the difficulty for these businesses is they're having trouble finding workers. So that's the trouble. For New Mexico specifically, the issue is New Mexico currently has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. I think only New York and Hawaii at the moment have a higher rate. And so it begs the question, if businesses are reporting that they have a bunch of position vacancies and they're not able to attract workers, and New Mexico has a very high unemployment rate, then what's going on?
So considering all our state has been through in the last year, are you surprised by this current crisis?
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily surprised by the crisis. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, well, why is this happening? Why does the unemployment situation in New Mexico look like this? You would expect if there's tons of vacancies, there's available positions, and you also have high unemployment, that those people who are unemployed would be interested in finding employment, thus, of course, bringing down the unemployment rate. For New Mexico specifically, there's a lot of factors at play that are slightly different in New Mexico than elsewhere. One, of course, the one that many people point to at the moment is that the sort of extended unemployment benefits that people are receiving, in addition to the bonus $300 per week for folks who are unemployed, is disincentivizing people going back to work. So that's, I think, a factor at play, especially when you look at what the average salaries are or the average wages for people in industries that have high unemployment right now would be making if they were actually going to work. So you would sort of anticipate there being some difficulty in recruiting people back to positions where they would be paid equal or less than what they are receiving in unemployment benefits potentially. But there's other factors too, and I don't think that we would have necessarily predicted it prior to the pandemic, but after seeing the pandemic play out and seeing the behavioral responses of both consumers and workers, I don't know that I'm super surprised. So for example, as businesses have been opened and closed at different points throughout the pandemic, you can imagine if you are an employee and you don't know that you're going to have a job tomorrow to go to, your business might be closed. And so you can't necessarily rely on the hours that you might have been able to rely on prior to the pandemic. And you might just be a little bit gun shy in terms of going back to work. So after the experience of the pandemic, I don't know that it surprises me that people might go the sure thing in terms of benefits that they would receive from unemployment insurance. And the sure thing in this case is a guaranteed check versus kind of rolling the dice and things may be closing or them having limited staffing at establishments. In addition to that, of course, you know, as I mentioned, people are getting paid a relatively higher rate than they might be getting paid if they actually went to work. So I think several factors go into play here for potential workers. And I think it's essentially pushing up the unemployment rate as a result.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned, you know, hospitality and leisure or tourism. What other industries are feeling these effects the most?
So Basically, no industry was unscathed as a result of the pandemic. All industries saw some type of downstaffing as a result of the pandemic. Leisure and hospitality is just the easiest one to point to because of the restrictions that were placed on businesses and the reluctance of the general public to go out into establishments that they might have otherwise frequented if the pandemic wasn't going on. So leisure and hospitality is really the easy one to point to. But tons of other industries were hit pretty hard as well. Industries such as construction, for example, saw pretty large downstaffing of employment. Industries like education and healthcare, and specifically healthcare in this case. Healthcare was hit, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, as a result of basically elective procedures or dentist office or things like that being forced to either close or cut back hours, thereby requiring staff layoffs and the like. And so those sorts of industries too were hit as a result of the pandemic. One that I think that you wouldn't necessarily think of that was hit as a result of the pandemic is government, actually. And specifically in this case, it's local government. Local government's kind of a little bit of a catch-all. Most of what's in local government is actually school teachers. So public school teachers, people working at the various elementary, middle, and high school systems throughout the state. But what's also included in local government, at least categorized there for the purposes of where we sort people into respective industries, is tribal businesses. And tribal businesses include the casinos and also even the kind of leisure and hospitality that goes along with the tribal-owned businesses on tribal lands. And so as a result of that, we've seen pretty huge reductions in the number of people working in those quote unquote local government. And much of that has been driven by not only budget difficulties by local and municipal governments and them having to slow down hiring or not fill vacancies that they might have filled otherwise. It also has to do with the downstaffing at tribal businesses as well.
Wow.
Oh, and also in addition to that, one other thing, and this is specific, kind of unique to New Mexico. So obviously the tribal businesses thing is somewhat unique to New Mexico. Other states have this issue too, but maybe not to the degree that we do. One industry that's pretty unique to New Mexico is mining. And we've seen before the pandemic, a pretty rapid increase in the number of people working in that industry as a result of drilling and extraction activities in the southeast part of the state in the Permian Basin that's adjacent to Texas, the counties at least that are adjacent to Texas, so Lee and Eddy County specifically. And we've seen a huge reduction in the number of people working in that industry, and it's driven almost entirely by downstaffing in that part of the state. So that's not necessarily directly related to the pandemic in the sense that it's not because there's restrictions on work hours or restrictions on business establishments being open or anything like that. This is more of a consequence of the general economic slowdown that resulted as a result of the pandemic. So essentially from the front end of the recession that was caused by the pandemic, and that industry has continued to suffer as a result.
Wow. Are there any industries in New Mexico that are already rebounding or close to being back to pre-COVID levels?
Yeah, there are a couple of them that are the ones, and actually, to be honest with you, I was a little bit surprised when I looked at the data myself, is retail trade, surprisingly. So retail trade is one of those industries that was hit really hard as a result of the pandemic at the very beginning, and you can imagine why that's the case. It's the same reason, essentially, that leisure and hospitality was. There were kind of restrictions and that went into place that reduced the number of hours that businesses could stay open, social distancing guidelines, and the like, that at the beginning and sort of throughout much of the pandemic has made it such that hiring has been sort of slow. The fact is now, at least the most recent data that I've been looking at, retail trade, employment in that industry, it's suggested that they're about 98% of the pre-pandemic levels. And so that's an industry that has somewhat surprisingly bounced back. And when you compare that to something like leisure and hospitality, that's about only 80 or so percent back to the employment levels that we were seeing prior to the pandemic, it's pretty surprising that something like retail trade has bounced back that strongly.
Oh, well, good for them. I'm glad to hear it. What do you see for the New Mexico workforce in the next year, or maybe the next 5 years?
So I think that there's kind of a different story, I'm guessing, over the next year compared to over the next 5 years. So over the next year, I think the workforce and just the general public is going to get to a point where it's starting to get more comfortable doing some of the things that we were doing prior to the pandemic. That includes going out to local establishments, doing it more frequently, and spending money in the local economy at a greater rate. I think that's going to take some time. I think that's going to take the rest of this year, if not longer, for some of those behavioral things go back to something that at least is a facsimile of what we would have called normal prior to the pandemic. I don't know that we're ever going to get back to where we were prior to the pandemic in terms of our behaviors. I think people are going to be, at least for the next several years, a bit more guarded with respect to how they interact with other people and how they frequent businesses and establishments. And so I think it's going to take some time to get back to where we were. Kind of incidentally, one of the things that we do, and kind of one of my primary responsibilities, is to try to look in the crystal ball and forecast the state economy. And one of the things that we forecast is basically employment levels in the state. And our forecast, at least in our forecast, we are assuming that the state isn't going to get back to pre-COVID levels in terms of the number of people employed until sometime around 2024. And so that's, around in that 5-year time frame that you were talking about. So what does the workforce look like in 5 years? I think it's going to look more like what things looked like prior to the pandemic. Of course, the farther you go out in the future, the more uncertainty there is. Are we going to get back behaviorally to where we were? Is New Mexico going to be a place that can attract other businesses from out of state or grow its local businesses? Those are questions we don't have the answers to, but we're assuming that sometime in the next 4 or so years, we're at least going to get back to employment levels that we saw prior to the pandemic.
Gotcha. And based on your knowledge and expertise, can you make a prediction for the New Mexico economy? Maybe, this year and in 5 years?
So I think that what we're going to see in the next couple of years is a relatively rapid rate of employment growth. But as I mentioned, we're not going to get, even with a relatively rapid rate of growth, we're not going to get back to where we were in terms of levels prior to the pandemic. One of the comparisons I pretty much always make is the comparison of this most recent recession and, of course, the pandemic related recession to the recession that happened in 2008 and 2009, kind of the banking related recession. Right. And there's a couple of reasons why I make that comparison. The easiest and most straightforward reason is, well, it's the most recent recession that we had prior to the current one. So that's the simplest thing. But the less simple, but I think more important reason I make the comparison is what we saw after the 2008-2009 recession is New Mexico at the outset of the recession, it seemingly wasn't hit as bad as other states. As a percentage of total jobs, we lost a relatively smaller percentage of jobs at the front end of the recession. But the problem was, after kind of the recession, the effects of the recession subsided nationally, New Mexico wasn't in a position, for whatever reason, to really get its economic engine going forward. And so the state more or less stagnated for about 10 years after that experience. What we've seen so far in the most recent kind of pandemic-related recession is we saw New Mexico again be somewhat insulated compared to other states at the front end of the recession, not getting hit quite as hard. So if you look at employment levels immediately pre and post when the pandemic began, New Mexico doesn't kind of dip as far as other states. The problem is New Mexico still hasn't, since kind of the initial shock of the pandemic, really started to add jobs at a rapid rate, whereas many other states have started to get things moving in a positive direction. So, for example, if you look at what New Mexico's employment levels looked like in the most recent month of data that are available in April of 2021, and you compare them to the levels just the month prior to when the pandemic really took hold, New Mexico is at somewhere around 92% of the employment levels that we saw prior to the pandemic. That puts the state in 48th place out of 50 states and DC in terms of the getting back to where we were prior to the pandemic. The only states that did worse are Nevada, New York, and Hawaii in terms of getting back to the employment levels that we were prior to the pandemic. And so the concern is New Mexico going to be in a situation where we have this really attenuated recovery that just takes forever, or are we going to get things moving kind of in a positive direction more rapidly than we did prior to the 2008-2009 recession? What I'll say about that, and I know I'm being kind of long-winded here, but what I'll say about that is the experience now seems to be a little bit different. Obviously, what was causing the recession in 2008-2009 is very different than the current, most recent one. But beyond that, there's been a lot of somewhat good news, actually, in terms of interest in the state. There's been a bunch of businesses, large businesses who have either kind of started operations in New Mexico or said that they're going to move or expand operations in New Mexico or to New Mexico. So, for example, Netflix said that it's going to expand operations or is interested in expanding operations. Facebook wants to expand its operations. Amazon is putting in a new fulfillment center in New Mexico. Intel as well said that they're going to be adding jobs at their plant in Rio Rancho. So there's, a ton of good news, and the type of good news that we didn't have right at the end of the beginning of the Great Recession. So I think New Mexico is poised to be in a better position now than we were during the Great Recession.
Wow. Well, it's nice to end on a high note. That's all I have for you. Do you have anything else that you want to tell our listeners?
No, I think that's about it. I mean, we track these data pretty closely. We watch them. We watch the ups and downs of the state economy. If you're interested in kind of what we do or the types of research that we do and the types of work that we do, definitely come and visit our website. And I'm sure Rand can provide that information for the listeners. And we would be happy to hear from everybody out there. Yeah, I definitely wanted to mention too, this has been a hot topic lately, like we started out discussing, and you've spoken to several media outlets, and all of those stories are available on our website as well under the news tab. But in the meantime, that wraps it up for us here at Enchanting Economics in New Mexico. Don't forget to check us out at BBER, that's bber.unm.edu, or on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube under @UNMBeaver. Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care.